is brought to you by the University of San Francisco, Masters in Data Science program, and sponsored by USS Data Institute. Today, I'm pleased to welcome Lauren Klein, who is Associate Professor in the Department of English and Quantitative Theory and Methods at Emory University, where she also directs the Digital Humanities Lab. The talk today is titled Data Feminism. We're going to be leaving questions to the end. For those of us who are joining online, if you have questions, please enter them using the Q&A box on the bottom of the screen. There's a button for Q&A, and we'll try to answer your questions. The audience here, please put up your hand and you'll have the microphone. Welcome, Laura.
Lauren, you ready?
Hi there. Sean, the volume is a little low on you. So if you say something to me and I don't respond as per what just happened, just say it again.
We can hear you loud and clear. So. Oh,
super. Okay. Okay, great. Well, hi, everyone. It's really nice to speak to you virtually. I wish it could be in person. My name is Lauren Klein, as you heard, and I'm actually going to share my screen. Let's see, do that. Let's get rid of Zoom. Okay. And this is a little bit of an exciting day because I am debuting a whole new slide deck theme set. So if there are any weird formatting issues, you should let me know. I just shifted over. I figured new academic year, time for a new look. So what I'm going to talk about today, and I'm going to hope to do it for about 35-40 minutes, is the question that you see up on the slide right here, which has to do with what data feminism actually means. And I want to begin by acknowledging that this talk is based on a book that I co-authored with D'Ignazio. You can see her right here up at the top. And if you're curious about the book or about any of the examples that I talk about today, I just wanted to draw your attention to the fact that the book is available online in open access version at datafeminism.io. And what I'm going to do today is briefly summarize the book's theoretical framework and then move on to a set of examples that illustrate what we mean by data feminism, that really sort of put data feminism in action. And then, as I've already said, I hope that actually leaves us a fair amount of time for discussion at the end. So to jump right in, the motivating premise of our book is that in the world today, data is a tremendous form of power. So data-driven systems have been used somewhat infamously to decide which people who have been accused of crimes to send home on bail while they await trial, and then which people to keep in jail for that same time. And that, of course, sets off this cascading chain of consequences that almost invariably impacts the rest of their lives. And here I'm talking about ProPublica's audit of these so-called pretrial flight risk assessment algorithms. You can see a screenshot from one of the articles about this on the bottom of the screen. You could think also of work by Virginia Eubanks. You can see this in Automating Inequality. That's another one of the screenshots that you see below. She's done work to show how data-driven systems have been used to identify parents who are suspected of child abuse, very often unfairly and with understandably just devastating consequences. In terms of what's going on in academia land, there was that recent fiasco around the algorithm used in the UK that was employed to predict the culminating A-level exam scores taken by essentially high school seniors because the exams were canceled because of the pandemic. I could keep on going. And part of the reason why I have more examples at the bottom of the screen is just to show that there are all sorts of people doing work on all sorts of issues that arise with respect to these issues. But the main point and the main takeaway of this sort of preamble is this. Data is incredibly powerful, but that power is currently wielded unequally. And more specifically, it's wielded by a small group of well-resourced institutions, both educational and commercial. They tend to be located in the global north, and their leadership consists mostly of elite white men. And this is where feminism, and intersectional feminism in particular, enters in. So before I get any further into the argument that we make in the book about why data science really needs feminism and can learn from feminism, can learn a lot from feminism, I just want to do some very basic level setting about what is it that we mean by feminism in the first place. And in the book, we present three related definitions of the term. So the first is, as you can see, a belief in equality for all genders. And this is really the core definition of feminism. But if you look around you, you realize that this goal of equality for all genders has not yet been realized in the world. And so feminism also necessarily involves organized activity on behalf of women and non-binary people to make this goal of equality the reality. And then feminism has a third definition, which is a set of theories and ideas. So these theories began by thinking through issues of inequality with respect to sex and gender, but the past 40 years of scholarship and just like the current political reality has brought many, many more dimensions of inequality into the conversation. So these include race, ethnicity, class, sexual orientation, ability, and more. So this brings me back up to this idea of intersectional feminism and how, in our view, and we say this in the book, feminism right now in the year 2021 must be understood as intersectional. So some of you actually may already know this. So intersectionality is this term coined by the legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, which uses to explain how social inequality cannot be described in terms of only one dimension of difference, like gender. Excuse me. So when we're talking about inequality or oppression, we have to be talking about the intersection of the many factors and forces that produce it. So racism, classism, colonialism, and so on. But the important thing to understand about intersectionality, and this is actually something that I think is often overlooked in casual or sort of journalistic invocations of the term, is that intersectionality doesn't just describe markers of individual identity. So it doesn't just mean like, I, Lauren Klein, I am white, I am a cisgender woman, I live in the global north in the US. Like it doesn't just mean these aspects of my identity. What intersectionality is describing are the structural forces of power and their intersection that make those aspects of my identity matter, that result in certain experiences of privilege that I experience as a result of those identity aspects on the one hand, and certain instances of oppression on the other that I may encounter in my life. And it's been the work of women of color feminists and Black feminists in particular that have foregrounded this conversation about forces of power, that have shifted the conversation from thinking about identity to thinking about root cause. So the basic argument that we make in the book is that intersectional feminism, the set of theories and ideas, when applied to data science, can help that unequal balance of power that it currently represents be challenged, be rebalanced, and be changed. Or if you just sort of want to put it more simply, data science really needs feminism and intersectional feminism in particular if we ever hope to overturn these power imbalances. So what we do in the book is use the teachings of intersectional feminism, and I should say along with some other ideas from feminist activism and critical thought, in order to arrive at these 7 principles for doing more ethical and equitable data science. So examine power, challenge power, rethink binaries and hierarchies, elevate emotion and embodiment, embrace pluralism, consider context, and make labor visible. And in the book, we actually have one chapter devoted to each of these principles, where we talk about the underlying feminist theory that informed our sort of development of that particular principle. And then mostly what we do is actually illustrate how that principle can be applied to data science through a lot of examples. And I'll just say more generally, our goal with writing the book was really to operationalize feminism for data science. So to provide a clear set of principles for people currently working with data, for people who want to work with data, or for people who want to refuse to work with data for ideological reasons. So what I'm going to do in my time today, I don't have time to run through examples from each chapter, but I've tried to pull out some examples that bring together multiple principles in the same example. And I'll walk you through them and explain why I think these examples demonstrate what we mean by data feminism. And so the first example that I want to talk about is this one. This is a project by the artist Mimi Onuoha. It's called the Library of Missing Datasets. It's actually an artwork, I should say, and it's displayed in two ways. So the first is actually as a GitHub repository. You can Google it. You can Google Mimi Onuoha Missing Datasets GitHub, and you'll find it. You can look at it while I'm talking. I will not be insulted. And if you go there, you'll see a list of missing data sets like the ones that you can see here. So you can read this, if I don't know how large the font is or if this is legible, but it has titles like trans people killed or injured in instances of hate crime, or people excluded from public housing because of criminal records. And I should say also this artwork predates COVID, but I think the way data collection has been carried out with respect to all sorts of issues relating to COVID, cases, vaccine rollout, access to resources, all kinds of things. I think that the ways in which everything related to COVID has had such disparate impacts, both in the United States and around the world, and even within social groups, has awakened us all to the dangers of missing data, which is exactly what this project is intent on showing. So in any case, so there's a second way to encounter this artwork, and that's as this physical installation that you see on the left, that file cabinet. And the idea is that you walk into a gallery, you see this file cabinet, you see the folders, you tab through them, you read the names of the data sets on the tabs, you think like, this one looks interesting, or that sounds really important. And you go and you open the folder, and then the folder is empty. And the point that Onuoha is trying to make here with this piece is that these empty file folders or these missing data sets, they're missing for a reason. And the reason is this profound imbalance of power with respect to data collection in the world today. So this imbalance of power is what determines what data are collected and what data are not, or what research is conducted and what research is not. So who has this power? Governments have this power, moneyed institutions have this power. Missing COVID data, this is another example that dramatizes this point, right? In general, minoritized groups tend not to have this power. And this is why a feminist approach to data science begins with an analysis of power, because far too often the data sets that we can access, and in turn, the questions that they prompt, they've already been affected or overdetermined by the imbalances of power that exist in the world. So feminicide in Mexico, and honestly, in pretty much every other country, is another case of missing data sets. So in the book, we tell the story of Maria Salguero, who resolved to head straight towards this issue of missing data and collect it herself. So just to back up a little bit, feminicides, these are gender-related killings of women and girls. They include both cis and trans women. They're legally defined as crimes in a handful of countries, including Mexico, actually. But the state does not systematically collect data on feminicides. And they're actually also the subject of emerging public anger in Latin America. So if you're interested, you can check out, there's a hashtag on Twitter, Ni Una Menos. And this is because of the way in which the state neglects to fully implement its own laws and provisions. So the laws are on the books, they are not being implemented. So frustrated by this lack of action, Salguero has single-handedly compiled the largest archive of feminicides in Mexico. She spends 2 to 4 hours per day logging feminicides on this Google map, which she culls from media reports. And her work has been used to help families locate loved ones. She's provided data to journalists and NGOs, and she's actually been called to testify in front of Mexico's Congress multiple times. So this is a form of what might be called feminist counter data. So activist data collection that steps in when the state and other institutions have systematically failed to ensure the basic safety of their population. And it represents one way to use data to challenge power. So another example that we talk about in the book, which I threw in because this map hopefully should be recognizable to you. This is another counter data collection effort. This one undertaken by the Anti-Eviction Mapping project, which, as you can see, is based out of San Francisco. We actually talk about this in the context of another principle, though, which has to do with embracing pluralism, by which we mean bringing many and multiple voices to the data science table. So since 2013, this is another project with a very big website, which you can check out. But the group known as the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, or the AEMP, has worked in collaboration with tenants' rights organizations and community groups in order to collect and map data about the eviction crisis in the Bay Area. So on this map, each red dot indicates a place where a person or a family has been evicted, and the blue dots indicate places where the AEMP has also interviewed one of the people who was evicted from that place. And if you click on one of the blue dots, it brings up one of these video interviews like the one that you see here on this slide. So we can contrast the AEMP map with the work of the Eviction Lab, which is based at Princeton. And so the eviction, we can and we do actually in the book, the Eviction Lab's goal is to present a national picture of the eviction crisis. And I should say, before I get into my critique, this is on its own a worthy project. It's a really valuable goal, but it's wildly different in terms of process. So you might look at this map, like keeping that Google map in the back of your mind, and look at this and say, okay, like I actually think I'm looking at bigger data here, right? I'm looking at a picture of the whole United States, not just San Francisco. You also might think, I think this is a little bit more rigorous. They're using Mapbox or something for their visualizations instead of Google Maps. Maybe it's a little bit more technically sound. However, what the AEMP has shown, because they actually directly take on this particular project, is that national real estate databases like the ones that the Eviction Lab uses significantly undercount evictions. So again, you can sort of, if you take a minute to think about this, you can understand why this might be true. So first of all, the real estate industry, not incentivized to count any more evictions than they have to, right? Bad for business. And then second of all, and this is something that I think rings true to a lot of students, like there are all sorts of ways to be evicted from your home that don't involve your landlord going to City Hall, filing the paperwork and presenting you with a formal eviction notice, which PS, by the way, happened to me in grad school. But you can think about like not fixing a leak in your ceiling, or the broken toilet, or like lurking in your lobby to make you feel unsafe, or just raising the rent a lot. These are all ways to, in effect, to sort of de facto get you evicted without actually being counted as a sort of de jure, to make the distinction between sort of what is letter of the law versus what is in effect the same thing. These are all de facto evictions. And because the AEMP works with local community groups, so the places where people go, where they say like, help me, this is happening to me, what do I do? They've developed a methodology for counting and compiling these evictions. What they have gathered is actually more accurate and more contextualized data that in truth documents a greater extent of the problem at hand. And so in the book, we talk about this as being what is gained by embracing pluralism. You get a better sense of the problem because you're listening to the people and learning from the people who are actually affected by that problem. So just sort of a note in terms of sort of pragmatic note. So, great, you like believe this, you're on board, ready to embrace pluralism. The reality is you can't actually bring every single person's voice to the table, right? Like we don't have enough time, we don't have enough resources, the table isn't physically big enough. Also, it's COVID time, so can't even show up together. So whose voices do we prioritize? And the nice thing is that feminist theory actually has a really clear answer for this. Like, you don't need to wring your hands. You can follow the work of Sandra Harding, Patricia Hill Collins, Sherwin Bardzell, who all say that a feminist design perspective means taking power into account and actively centering the experiences of people at the edges and the margins first and foremost. So it's, in effect, making decisions, especially design decisions, from the outside in. And so we have a quote on the bottom of the slide from the Design Justice Network, which is another great website with great resources. They say, quote, "We center the voices of those who are directly impacted by the outcomes of the design process." And the same thing holds true for the design of data science projects. So these are the folks who we should be working hard to build relationships with. Okay, I'm going to sort of switch gears here. The previous examples have focused a lot about the issue of power and people. So people who have power and then people who don't. But another idea that comes from feminism and feminist theory in particular has to do with more conceptual structures of power. So, and more specifically, binary structures that are defined by a hard distinction between two groups. So feminist theory has helped to show how these binary distinctions are usually hiding a hierarchy with one group on the top and the other on the bottom. And then once you see the hierarchy, you start to understand why the hard line between those groups, like why it's there in the first place. And it's there to ensure that the one group stays on the top and the folks on the bottom aren't able to sort of creep up and sort of take away power from the folks who already have it. So you may already know this or be seeing where I'm going with this. So the distinction between the idea of man and woman, this is the obvious reference point, and it was the starting point for feminist theory, since it's a clear example of both a false binary and an unequal hierarchy, right? So there's more than two genders, and among them, no gender is better intrinsically than any of the others. But one of the key moves of feminist theorists over, I would say, the past 40 years, really since the 1970s, has been to take this critique of the gender binary and use it to question other binaries and hierarchies that we encounter in the world. So like the distinction between nature and culture. This is why feminists always really love cyborgs. You can think of in terms of pedagogy. Feminist pedagogy does a lot of dismantling the hierarchy between teacher and student, saying, okay, like, let's think about this. In a classroom, everyone knows that students learn from teachers, but teachers also learn from students. It's much more of an even exchange. And honestly, the reason why there is such a imposed or rigid hierarchy in which the teacher is authorized as the teacher and the students are not, is to sort of validate and protect the status of the teacher. So feminist pedagogy does a lot to, again, the move is like topple the hierarchy, flatten or smush together the binary, right? Smush together the binary. But I'm actually going to go into like an even more heady realm, and I want us to think about the distinction between reason and emotion as another one of these false binaries and unequal hierarchies. So in the sort of general Anglo-Western context in which we operate in the United States, we've mostly been taught that reason is somehow better than emotion. This has to do with the Enlightenment and long and complicated historical reasons. But we actually see this play out in the present in data and in data visualization in particular. So if you think about what best practices are for data visualization, it's like a clean design, a minimalist aesthetic, present just the facts. But the question remains, why are these our best practices, especially when research in that very same field? So when there's like subfield of computer science, it used to be a couple of subfields, now people just call it visualization, which entails a lot of user studies and research and testing on the creation of data visualization. And a lot of this research has shown that we actually interpret these aesthetic choices, so this desire, this minimalism, this sort of seemingly stripped down presenting of just the facts, we actually interpret these just as emotionally. We tend to believe that these types of charts are more truthful than they actually are. So there's someone at Northwestern named Jessica Holman. She's shown that just including a source line for a data visualization makes people trust that visualization more. It doesn't matter whether the source line, like source : URL actually points to a real data set or not. There's a really interesting paper out of MIT. I believe the first author was Crystal Lee, and she shows how people who circulate misinformation and disinformation about COVID on Twitter actually accompany their totally made up facts with very objective looking or scientific looking visualizations like bar charts and time series charts and stuff like this, because they know that those charts will make their, again, totally fabricated data seem more scientific and real. But actually, I want to think for a minute about the opposite right now, which is visualizations that deliberately leverage emotion. So active sort of lean into the idea that emotion has communicative and rhetorical power. So that's what this next example helps us explore. So what you're looking at here, they're actually screenshots of an animated visualization. It's of the number of gun-related deaths in the United States in a particular calendar year. You're looking at 2018 here. And again, this is another one you can Google. The URL is right up here. You can watch it while I'm talking. Again, won't be insulted. But if you go to the website, or if you don't, what you would see is each person killed by a gun in that year represented as a single arc. And the arcs are traced out one by one on the screen. That's what you see in the smaller screenshots. They start out really slow, so you can read the identifying information associated with each person. But then they get faster and faster until you can no longer keep up. You can no longer read the information. You can't even see the information. That's that semicircular sort of web that you see in the larger image. And I mean, I find it at this point, I've watched this visualization hundreds of times, and each time I find it really overwhelming, almost unbearable. And that is the point of the visualization. You know, it goes on for so long. Like, you think certainly there must have been, you know, enough people have been killed. Like, there can't be any more people who have died, but it keeps on going. But that is the point, right? It goes on for too long because there are too many people being killed by guns in the United States. There are too many deaths plotted on the visualization because too many people are actually being killed. So it's another epidemic. So I just want to back up and say, methodologically, it's no less statistically sound than any other study. So when you finish watching the visualizations, their methods pop up, and you learn that the data about the people derived from a national crime data set released by the federal government. It's available at crimes.gov, is a thing I didn't know existed until this project. One of the things that the project does is it projects the lifespan, how long the person would have lived had they not been killed by a gun in that year. And those projected lifespans are determined using a model released by the World Health Organization that has like 50 different parameters. But the visualization was viewed with intense suspicion from the visualization community because it made us feel things. And a feminist approach here would say, you know, that's not a problem at all that it made us feel things. And actually, it's a more compelling visualization precisely because it blends intentionally reason with emotion. So what you get if you rebalance reason and emotion, again, you take that false hierarchy, you topple it over, and then you get rid of the distinction. What you get is a much richer data communication toolbox that lets you focus on what really matters in a design process. So honoring the context of the data, listening to the experience it purports to represent, and then taking action to challenge the imbalances of power that we encounter in the world. So just a couple more points that I want to make before we get to the Q&A. So if it's not already apparent, the principles of data feminism apply to every stage of a data science project. So from inception and funding to production and circulation and impact in the world. And then the final point that I want to make today before the Q&A, and this actually may already be obvious from the examples that I've shown you, but it's that data feminism insists on an expanded definition of data science. So our data science isn't defined by the size of the data set or the prestige or the credentials of the people undertaking the work, because these concerns have been continually over time used to exclude women and people of color from the field, as well as, I should say, to exclude work that makes a contribution that is socio-technical rather than purely technical or methodological. But if we expand our definition of data science, then we can clearly see that some of the most exciting work that is happening today is being undertaken by artists, by journalists, by humanists, by community organizers, by activists. And sure, some of this work does look like traditional data science. And here we want to give a shout out to Margaret Mitchell and her team at Google for their research on, or I guess formerly at Google, we can talk about that a little bit later, but up until maybe 6 months ago, Dr. Mitchell was the co-lead of Google's ethical AI research group, dismantled in the wake of some pretty reprehensible corporate behavior. In any case, that's a topic for a later discussion. In any case, what you're looking at is a paper that she wrote a long time ago on bias in natural language processing techniques. It's a great paper. I use it in my classes. But then next to Dr. Mitchell's work, you see, for example, an interactive AI sculpture.
Hello, guys. Hello.
Hello. So I don't know where that voice is coming from, but I'm gonna keep on talking. I'm almost done. You're looking at in the middle of this interactive sculpture created by the artist Stephanie Dinkins, and this was trained on an intergenerational dialogue between Black women. And then on the right, you see some data journalism by the group The Pudding, which is sort of inventive and fun, and it looks at gender bias in Hollywood screenplays. And then below on the very bottom, you find Data Therapies work with community-based organizations. What they do is they go into communities, help communities and community groups examine their own data, and then create what they call data murals on the basis of what they found during that data analysis process. And we have literally hundreds of examples like this in the book, which we selected to illustrate our points and really sort of inspire readers to action, because one of the things that we say a lot in the book, which is that, we recognize that data is at the root of so many problems today, but it also can be part of the solution. So that's really all I've got in terms of my formal remarks. Here are a lot of different ways to get in touch with both me and with Catherine. We have websites. Our book has a website. We're both on Twitter. We're both on GitHub. We're both on Instagram, although Catherine's a better Instagrammer than I am. And then the one last thing that I'll say is that we actually, if you feel like either having a screensaver or some art in your room, we actually were invited a couple of months ago to be part of an exhibition in Mexico City about data. And we turned the principles of data feminism into an infographic. So if you visit, again, our website, datafeminism.io, you can download these infographics. We have them in 5 different languages and with a bunch of actually other languages coming really soon. And yeah, so that's it. Thanks so much for listening. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and hear your thoughts.
All right. If you have a question, please put your hand up and I'll hand you the microphone.
Oh my God, Dota.
Sorry. Okay. One initial question I had was over the label data feminism. From what you were explaining, it seems like you're covering a lot of different types of kind of binary elements. Do you think the title still reflects the kind of expanse of the field that you're addressing, especially with relation to data?
Sure. I mean, that's a really good question. And it's actually one that we get a fair amount. So the short version is like, yes. But I think the longer answer is that, a lot of the work that has been done that has trained us to examine unequal power relations and think about how the effects of unequal power are experienced differentially by different groups has been the work of feminist activists and feminist critical thinkers in the very long history of this feminist organizing work. And so that's sort of one point. And one of the ways in which our project is a feminist project and is a more specific project than sort of general data science for social good type work is because, as you could tell, I said this, a lot of times during my talk, it begins with an analysis of power, of acknowledging and working from the starting point that those power imbalances are real, and that they are sort of necessary to dismantle before we can sort of work towards justice. So that's one aspect of why it remains a feminist project. And then the second thing that I'll say about these feminist critiques of binary ways of thinking, this is sort of like a nerdy sort of feminist theory kind of point, but we have lots of different conceptual models and models for formal critique that come from all different ways of thinking. But the formal critique, the sort of abstract model of first identifying a binary opposition, and then second, naming it or recognizing it as a hierarchical and binaristic opposition, and then third of all, collapsing it, comes from sort of the first wave of feminist theorists that emerged in response to things like structuralist theory, and even the first wave of post-structuralist theory, which was kind of unanchored from the real world. Like until the feminists entered in, it was mostly just talking about language. And since then, that sort of mode of critiquing unequal power relations has been abstracted even further and has moved it away from, actual men and actual women. But the original work of presenting us with this formal model did come from early feminist thinkers. And so it's really important. It is really important to think about, and I think, credit these early feminist thinkers for this larger way of thinking that I think you're right, like has sort of entered and influenced a lot of other and subsequent ways of thinking, but it begins with early feminist work.
I just want to apologize for the interruptions we're getting. We'll admit it back into the room again.
Yeah, I thought the talk was really great, and I think it's really interesting how you're connecting it into a lot of the tech. Something more recent was word embedding and GPT that evaluates different names and provides them with different scores. I feel like it's an ongoing issue, but do you have any general ideas on how something like that would be tackled, where different names, different pronouns are evaluated with different levels? So how do we bring
Sure.
this on?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And actually, so just to sort of back up a little bit and give some context. So when I was talking about Margaret Mitchell's work at Google and the dismantling of the ethical AI team there. So the reason why, and many of you may know this, but if not, it's like interesting and I think sort of pretty important industry level context. So the reason why Google dismantled their ethical AI team was that Margaret Mitchell and her co-lead, Dr. Timnit Gebru, had published a paper about the biases inherent in large language models, including GPT-3, but not limited to GPT-3. And they had sent this through Google's internal peer review mechanism, which, like, if any of you, like, I've done this, like anytime you co-author or author with a Google employee, if you want Google's name to be on the paper, it needs to go through their internal, both technical review and then comms review. And the paper initially passed through the technical review, but then got kicked back and they were asked to retract it. And when Dr. Gebru said, like, why is this? Why? It seemed okay. We've cited legitimate research. She got no answer. And then she sent an inquiring email and also sort of said, like, I think this is connected to your failures with respect to general DEI efforts. And she was summarily fired. No warning, like kicked out of Google systems, et cetera. And then a couple months later, her colleague, Dr. Mitchell, was also fired. And then they did this big reorg, and now there is nominally some other ethical AI team, but it's not led by anyone with experience actually considering these issues. So that's a long way of saying both, like, you are totally right to connect the issues that we talked about in data feminism, sort of trace them forward to technologies that honestly, like, large language models barely existed when we were finishing the book in I think we submitted it finally in like April 2019. So this is really just becoming an issue. And also to say that these issues have, I think, become even more central to the point that the largest corporations in the world are kind of scared of the reality of these products, which is that they are fundamentally racist and sexist sort of text generation machines. In terms of what to do, one of the interesting things about the paper, it's called stochastic parrots, or the dangers of, I forget what the subtitle is, but you can look for it. But one of the things that the authors, and there's more than just the two of them, there's like 6 authors or something on the paper, advocate for are a lot of the things that I was talking about in this talk in slightly more concrete or directed terms. So it would have been good, for example, before GPT-3 scooped up like fanfic on the internet, which tends to be like pretty sexist and racist and xenophobic, or like scooped up all of Reddit, which again tends to be pretty sexist and racist and xenophobic. In order to train their model, they might have thought, like, what is the meaningful content that we should include in our model so that we can produce something that is not so fundamentally flawed because it is trained on, like, all of the ways in which we know the internet to be terrible. Another thing, though, once you do that, and I guess this is another, with respect to GPT-3, there are some better options, like BERT is slightly better. There's now a couple of models that are trying to have a little bit more curated approach to training their data, but to say, like, can we benchmark this? Can we document this? Can we accompany this with some sort of documentation so that people know what it is that they're using, and it doesn't just remain like a completely black box thing. And then the third thing is regulation, right? So once these things are unleashed in the world, they're very, very hard to control because our governments, especially in the United States, tend to be very reactive rather than proactive. And we need to have people who are saying, these are the contexts when they should be used, or I think more importantly, these are the contexts in which they should not or should never be used, with the knowledge that these large language models are very difficult not to have be biased in all the ways that we know.
Diane, you had a question?
Yeah, thank you for the great talk. It was really, we learned a lot. One question that I have is that seems like it is a critical ethics related problem and might be like something that people might not be affordable to have as, I guess, their full-time job to research about this, but I'm pretty sure there are many people, including myself, want to volunteer or know more about it. What kind of like resources or like for example, organization that people can volunteer to, or pretty sure there might be a lot of people are needed in order to do a research and development. Is there any opportunity open to the public to involved in this problem?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that honestly, the best way, especially for all of you taking this seminar series, because you actually have technical skills, right, is to figure out an organization, a nonprofit or a local organization or a community group that might have the need for someone with more technical skills and ask them if they need help, right? I mean, I think the temptation, especially, coming from tech skills programs is a little bit solutionist to be like, oh, I have all these new skills, I'm going to solve this new problem, like, let's go have a hackathon, right, make an app. But the reality is that the people who know best about what the issues are and also the solutions that are needed are usually the people who've been working on those issues for a very long time. With that said, they tend not to have as much tech expertise as they need because they usually can't afford to pay like corporate tech salaries. And they don't always have the technical infrastructure, again, mostly for financial reasons. And so I increasingly believe that the best thing to do is like find an organization that is meaningful to you, or that you've seen around, and just write to them or see if they have a, volunteers needed kind of thing. And ask, just ask. And if they say no, like also listen to that and go look elsewhere, because sometimes it can not be the most productive thing to have like someone sort of, knocking at your door all the time. The other thing that I'll say is that there's all sorts of need for mentoring and all sorts of local meetups and nonprofits that have to do with data science education. And this is another place where I truly think that mentors are desperately needed. all of like pretty much for every single underrepresented group in data science, there is a local nonprofit in your city that is trying to get more of that group into data science. And so I would say like, see if they accept mentors, then all you really need to do is continue to show up. Like so much of this is like, make a commitment and follow through on it, even if it's just once a month, show up to a Zoom. I think that can go a long way.
Hi, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how, and this is a subjective question, but sort of in your opinion, where the balance lies between sort of data-driven solutions to this issue and then more of like the data-driven investigation of and identification of bad models, sort of, or bad AI, just sort of in the immediate, what is more pressing and
Yeah, I love that question. And it's one that I think about honestly all the time. And I feel like my answer, I tend to flip-flop as to whether I think, just sort of rephrase what you just said, which I think is true, which is whether there is a role for data science in advancing social good and really leading the way and charting the course, or whether the most important role of sort of justice-oriented data science is almost as a counter data science, so that like it's always the pushback against the dominant forms of power. And so like to it, like that is the example of like the large language model debate, where it's not clear that there is enough carefully curated data at this point in the world to create a model that is equal in its predictive power to the models that currently exist. Like for that to happen, it would involve a large scale effort requiring all sorts of expertise and then paying people for their expertise in order to create a data set that is as large as the ones that you get if you just like scrape the internet, right? However, in other areas, I do think there are ways that data can be used to expose, to identify issues, and to call attention to, in particularly, issues that I think individuals experience on a daily basis, but have not yet been grouped together as a form of, or a sort of a result of some form of structural oppression or structural power imbalance. Like in the book, we talk a lot about the issue of women's maternal mortality, and in particular, Black women's maternal mortality in the United States, and how until very recently, when there was a large scale, again, it was undertaken by a journalist, or actually a group of journalists. There was actually ProPublica was involved. Also, interestingly, USA Today got on board as well. But until there was this large scale systematic data collection effort aimed at tracking the number of Black women who were killed or by bad medicine as they gave birth, it was just a situation where it happened to a lot of people and families, and people just thought it was a unique occurrence, that it wasn't the result of structural oppression, or if they did, or, if they knew it in their bodies, they didn't have the data to back that up. And there was sort of a series of sort of interesting developments that took place. For one, there were a series of Black-led reproductive justice groups that, after years and years of advocating for better data collection, they started to be heard at the same time that, interestingly, Serena Williams experienced a complication in her own childbirth that, had she not been Serena Williams and told the doctors, I have a blood clot, scan me, give me the drugs right now, she would have died. And then she launched this advocacy campaign. And this was coupled with, honestly, the CDC finally coming around to the issue that this was real, and starting to seek out additional disaggregated data on maternal mortality, not just by age, but also by race and ethnicity, that there was sort of this coming together of national sort of data collection and therefore awareness of this issue. Not that, honestly, I think it has really resulted in better medicine yet, but I do think that that was an example where this sort of groundswell of support, coupled with sustained activism, coupled with intentional data collection, really did shine a spotlight on this systematic problem that hadn't been attended to before there was national comprehensive data to say, look, we've been telling you this is a real problem.
Hi, I have a pretty general question just about like entering the workforce. When you enter the workforce, how do you like make sure or like try and get a company to embody the ideals of data feminism or like hold them accountable if they don't? Like, how do you navigate that while entering the workforce?
Yeah, it's another really good question. I think in many, well, so I guess one major question is, in general, when you have technical skills, you do have more choices than most people do when looking for employers. And so if there's a company with a bad track record, like just don't work there. But if you already work there and you discover it after you're already hired, and I will say, like, there are reasons to work at big companies as well, both financial, and then also there's an important role for people who are trying to change things from within. I think the most important advice is to like find your people. This is not work that can be undertaken or sustained on your own. And so I think, if you get to a company, you should look around and try to think like who is thinking, like, try to figure out who is thinking like you, who seems to raise the same objections at team meetings. Is there some sort of interest group within the company that exists already that is devoted to these issues that you're caring about? Because again, like I said, especially when you're super junior and you're super new and you're not sure of the best way to get people within a particular corporate or just sort of company culture to listen, your best guides and your best allies are the people who are there already.
Hello. Hello, I have a question about the realization part. What we learned about realization is like we need to make it simple and like give information directly. But when we are facing public, like we want to draw public attention on some important issues, some group, it seems like we need to make it pretty or at least draw more attention. So like it's difference between like simple, clear, and pretty. Is this a like challenge for data science, or we need more like collaboration from artists or something like that?
I think my answer to you was like yes and yes. Like I would love to see more collaboration with artists, because I think one of the things that artists think about a lot is the meaning that is conveyed through their design choices. But I think the other thing to bear in mind is that whether you like it or not, there is meaning conveyed through your design choices as well. And so that was sort of my point about objective visualizations actually carrying a lot of communicative power. Like there's no such thing as some like neutral objective representation in the world. When you are visualizing something, you are always making choices about like what categories to visualize, which ones to exclude, about what format you choose, what format you don't choose, how you label it, where you make the scale, and like all of these things are design choices, and they just need to be thought through, right? And you need to ask yourself, like, what am I trying to convey? And if what you're trying to convey is I want people to look at the results of this study, then you make your choices in a way that it points people to the results of the study. Oftentimes though, and this is actually a point that we make in the book, studies themselves have conclusions, right? Like usually the studies are not just like, I collected some data. Usually there's an analysis. And at the end, there's like findings or conclusions. And so when you're creating a visualization on the basis of a data set, our advice is to really like look at those findings, and in addition to conveying the data that was collected, also again through either your title or your choice of representational form, typology, or whatever, think about how you can best and most clearly and most efficiently convey what was found through this study, right? Because that really is your task, not to try to sort of go back and try to remove layers of complexity or findings from the data, but to try to translate whatever it was that was found in the report into a different communicative form.
Thank you. Thank you, Lauren. I think that's all the questions we had today. So I want to thank you for coming here and sharing with us today. Could we have a round of applause for Lauren? Everyone for attending today. I look forward to seeing some of you in future seminars. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. No, hi, Leslie.
Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us.
Bye.
Have a good day.